I went through, battalion and on back, and they'd asked me, and I kept complaining about my leg, and of course the OD pants, they couldn't see anything there, so finally they dropped my pants, my OD wear, and I had a big whelp on my leg where the heat of it had gone through and burnt my skin, but it didn't even scorch my pants or anything. Just show you how odd it is, that phosphorus and stuff, you know. And
was it a mine?
it was, I tripped it. It was a fragmentation type of thing, and so I tripped it. Anyway, they cleaned it my hand as best they could, and by that time it was swelling, hurting, gave me some pain pills. I think Packard had already taken care of that. Sprinkled penicillin in. That's the first I heard about penicillin. They had penicillin powder and they sprinkled in the wound. So eventually they got me back to this hospital, which had been taken from the Germans. Earlier I understood it was a schoolhouse and it had been converted into a hospital. And I went in there, and the first thing they did, checking in, they took all my clothes and except my personal stuff, and went into the ward, operating room, and it was just one line of operating tables after another. They were on both sides of the room of this area. No one was in there. So it was a lax time. And it started out with a lieutenant or a captain and a medical officer and a nurse, and then they brought in somebody else, and eventually there was about 8 or 10 people in there just looking. As I mentioned, it was a slack time, so they called people in. By that time, when they was looking at it and everybody, I said, just don't cut it off. Just don't cut it off. Well, soldier, you'll be all right. We'll take care of it. I said, don't cut it off. They gave me a hypo. They gave me this sodium pentothal deal and says, start counting backwards from 100. I don't remember reaching 98. I mean, I was out. Next thing I remembered, since I was ambulatory, which means that I wasn't bedridden, or I could walk around and all, so they put me in a tent outside the main area, and that's where I came to. And they were laughing because they were talking to me, and I started telling them what I was saying. They wouldn't believe it, because the truth serum, you know, you can ask questions, and while you're under the influence, why you'll answer them. But I started talking and answering, and they said something, and I said, well, I know what I'm talking about. No, you don't. And they said repeat, and I'd start repeating everything. And when the nurse and her aide enlisted man, well, they left and left me alone. And so it was kind of remarkable. And
where was the hospital?
This was outside or in Eupen, E-U-P-E-N, Eupen, Belgique. And so my experience with the Belgiques came that I needed to use the restroom, and I remembered that there was the restroom, and I went in, and I had from outside, instead of going to one of their latrines, I came back into the hospital to use this magic commode sink water, and so I had my arm with a partial cast on it, and I had to clothe myself, and you can imagine clothing yourself, and I wanted to do it myself, so I had used just my right arm and hand to do this. So imagine me putting on my ODs and putting on my underwear, long johns, and putting on everything, and my shoes and my socks. They kept my boots up there. They said those ones that I had, the 3, because they were short supply, so they kept my boots like they did my rifle, and so somebody else could have it. So with all that and a sweater, shirt and sweater and my jacket, they issued with a new issue, clean. I went back to this restroom, which was right across the room where I had come in. They took my clothes and just right down the hall from the operating room. So I was in there, and I heard the outer door open up, and I heard this noise, and they come over, and they started using the sink and everything, and they came over to the door of the closet where I was, and I had locked it, and shook on it a little bit. Well, I thought it might have been somebody that they were bringing in that needed to use the restroom, see. So I reached up, pulled the chain, and reached down and got my ODs, long johns, and my pants and everything. Held everything up without buttoning them or everything. Held it with my right hand after I opened the door and went out, and here was this woman standing there. Well, it turned out it was one of the helpers up there, and she'd come in for cleaning supplies and everything. And when she saw me in that condition, she came over, hit my hand. Well, when she hit my hand, everything dropped. And there I stood, with a shock on my face, barely 20 years old, front line in the hospital. She reached down, got my ODs, pulled them up, buttoned them. So she dressed me. And there I stood, and the only thing I could say was merci. And when I said merci, she just grinned and laughed, said merci, merci, and she rattled off, I guess, Belgique. And I left. So you got some nice people over there if you want to know. So I stayed there, and then night went from Eupen to Liège, Belgium. January the 1st, the biggest warehouse out on the side of Liège that I'd seen. All kinds of patients, getting them ready on the train back to Paris or to Le Havre or wherever they were going, and so forth, and just stacked in there. You couldn't imagine how many patients, soldiers of all kinds, I guess, in there. And fortunately, that day, the C-47s, or the DC-3s, whatever you call it, had pulled gliders over, and that was when basically they were bringing them over. And the DC-3s, after releasing the gliders with the troops and everything, came back, landed there, and they were going to take the ambulatory patients that they could back to England. I was chosen. So we went out to the field, got on the plane with the bucket seats and everything, cold, and the pilot apologized because the heating unit in there wasn't working, and he didn't want us to object. And we said, we ain't objecting at all. And we had to fly low when we left, and had to bypass Brussels because the Germans had some of the remnants of their Air Force up that day. And so we flew low, skirted them. Pretty soon I saw the white cliffs of Dover. We crossed over, and January 1st we landed at Swindon, England. And so Swindon, England is when I started my series of shots every 4 hours for penicillin in the rear end. And I mean, it didn't make any difference where you were, asleep or what, you got your penicillin shots. And that went on there, and eventually for 24 hours for 2 weeks on that as a precaution. That was before they learned that they could take enough dosage and it wouldn't hurt you. They would take that. So that was my experience back to January the 1st. And then they sent me to a general hospital at Devizes, England, near it, called Earl Stoke Manor. And I stayed there from January the 2nd to in March, when they ZI'd me, Zone of Interior. And then from there I went up to Liverpool, put on the New Amsterdam luxury liner. At that time it was about the third largest one in the world, I think. And by ourselves we wigwag. Instead of wigwagging like we did coming over, we changed course about every 5 minutes. We went basically straight course, and I landed and saw the Statue of Liberty for the first time in my life about March the 17th. March 15th, 17th, something like that. And went to Camp Shanks, New York. I was there 2 or 3 days, and when they weren't looking at me or so forth, no on duty. Well, then that's when I got to visit as a tourist in New York City. Then from there, they put me on a train and took me to Palm Springs, California at Torney General Hospital. And they were supposed to say, hey, we'll take it close to home. Well, that was the closest home as they'd get me at that time. So then they wanted to send me to Letterman up at San Francisco. I said, can't you send me somewhere else? They said, all right, El Paso. Then from El Paso, I went to El Paso, stayed there to November, and went to Fort Sam Houston at Brooke Convalescent Hospital. From Brooke Convalescent Hospital in January, they told me that due to my convalescence, my therapies and all, that was all I could do. The medical officer called me in and talking, just real informal like. Said, yeah, I want to have you sign a piece of paper for me. And I said, sure. He said, well, we need that. So I took the pen with my right hand and all and looked at me, and he said, well, I can't give you a CDD because your injury is to your left hand, so you've got to go back through processing, going back to active duty. This was in January of '46. So started processing me, and I got back, I believe it was Dodd Field, the reception, the center there at Fort Sam Houston. And I was sitting there talking to the fellow who's figuring out my points, and I was 5 points short of getting out based on overseas service and the whole work. And while I was sitting there, there's a telegram came in. They had reduced the points by 5 points, and I had enough to get out. So,
what'd you do on DE Day?
I was on the train going back from hometown here in Oklahoma City to my camp. I was out in California, and I was on the train when that news came in. And well, man, I hooped and hollered, but of course you can't do too much on the train, when you're going back. But I was, and that was fantastic. But my mind automatically then went to the South Pacific because it wasn't over in South Pacific, and so being on furlough and knowing that I was still in the hospital, and still the possibility of what would happen when I would get out. And at that time, I'm sure that they would know or had known some system that they were going to let us all out, which is a point system. At that time, no one knew. So that was always in our minds. And of course, my buddy Joe Hebert that got his back hurt, due to that buzz bomb hitting. He didn't come back to our outfit. He eventually wound up on the outfit at Marseilles, and he actually went to South Pacific, and he thought, he was already over in that area. So by the time that the war was over in Europe, they'd already had been transferring and were transferring and porting men straight from Europe over to the Pacific zone of operations from that standpoint. So I would say that was in my mind because I did not know how I was going to wind up or any way. And when you're an ambulatory patient and in something like that, you just go day by day. Basically, you're going through occupational therapy, and you're going through the different deals of them finally determined. I had also hurt my back, injured my back, and of course x-rays been taken, and orthopedic wise, bones won't show up if they're not broken and everything, and it turned out later years where my problem was when I wrenched the back and service and all, it affected the nerves going through the disc system, and those things are hard to pick up. And so these are things that basically you do what you do with the friends that you make going away, and sometimes these friends are just 2 or 3 days, and sometimes they're a week, and then your trails cross. It's surprising how your trails will cross. And I learned not to judge people a lot of times because some of those that I thought would do certain things up on the front line, it was just the opposite. But some of the ones you thought wouldn't do anything, they're the ones that finally you could depend upon. So you can't always judge human nature, and I found that this was true in life as the time went on after I got out of service.
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
When you first realized the Germans were coming, what was your reaction?
Oh, gee. This is my first reaction, and of course immediately when that tank, we saw those tanks, I went back in and told our squad sergeant, so he got all our squad out, and we were outside the entrance of the pillbox, because we would have headed for those foxhole of ours, depending on the circumstances. But it's just like I mentioned to you, running across that field, that open area to that pillbox, that bunker, that you're trained to do something and you do it automatically. And as time goes on, you learn these things and you don't make a mistake. If you make a mistake, you're gone or somebody else is gone. And actually having hand-to-hand combat, or seeing somebody drop in front of me by the rifle, that didn't happen to me. I know that I was indirectly responsible by shooting in the embrasure, could have hurt somebody, or doing some of these things. I have talked to fellas afterwards, before and afterwards, that were in the Bulge, and they said that the firing of the men, as they stopped, the Germans came across their foxhole, they withheld fire, and as they stepped over their foxholes, that's when they started shooting. I talked to a fellow that indicated to me when I went back that some of the Germans came down the road, and this was one of those emplacements that here was a foxhole, another foxhole behind, and then there was a BAR gun and a protector, and then behind that there was a light machine gun, and there was a bazooka in the area, and then there was a heavy machine guns and then a mortar. So where these tanks and everything come up, well, this German came up this road, and he went ahead, just like that it was an everyday fact, that he just shot the German, just, started peppering them. So there's some that didn't affect and some that did. I was in the hospital there in England with a fella that we used to line up, because the ambulatory patients went to the cafeteria, the mess hall, and we lined up so we could get a seat for this guy that had been involved in an artillery barrage or something. He was happy with it, but we called him 88 because all at once he would come out just like an 88 and just grin and laugh and everything, and he put on quite a show, and he was happy with it, but he was shell-shocked. And there's different things that you get involved with. I can go around talking like I am now. There's a lot of fellows who won't talk, depending on the degree of what they went through. I've been with some of my buddies that were POWs that talk just like I am, but there was others, they won't say nothing. They won't even comment as today what went on. And I think that by my leaving the front, being in the hospital and the time, and then going through the convalescent deal and all, and I wrote poems and things of this nature, wrote about my life as I'm speaking in this day, wrote it down, that I think that was an avenue that helped me out, because I never had some of these things these fellows had. Some of those fellows didn't have things I had. So I think that is kind of a pretty well description of your, as an answer to your question.
Did you have any? Do you know why the Germans didn't take your position?
There was a German officer that made the comment, who was captured after I left near the Rhine somewhere, wanted to know when he was captured who those people were, the soldiers in the Battle of Bulge that held that ground in Hoffen area, that and they asked, and he was told, and he was asked this very same question that you asked me. He said, mere stubbornness, determination, and intelligence. Words to that effect. And that came from the German officer that commanded some of these troops. They couldn't figure out. In fact, by holding this eliminated, because this was one of the main forces that was to link up in this German drive. They were on the outskirts of Eupen, Belgique, and I guess we were 30 or 40 miles from them. I'm guessing that.
That's how far they gone past you.
Yeah, we were surrounded. Yep. And Malmedy and Bastogne was right to our south, and Earthenborn was right south of us, and all. And you can tell where that is on the map. So we were at the northern edge, but we were right in the kind of the middle. We were south of Aachen, and from the time that we went up on the front line, the Americans was in the process and had got Aachen, and it's our understanding that from our position, if the Germans recaptured it, they could shell all American-held territory at that particular time from that area.
Where you were?
Where we were located, our battalion, the 3rd Battalion. That's right.
Have any contact with the Belgian people around the age?
No, I've had one contact with in Hoffen, and he must be the mayor or so forth. I've contacted him, and he sent me a book in German about Hell in Hurricane Force. That's translated in English, and sent me pictures of Hoffen, the Alzen area, and also Joe Todd has provided me a name of people in Belgique at May. I have also written the mayor of Eupen, which I haven't heard, and these are the basically the contacts that I made. In my contact, which I have not heard from those in May, I mentioned the fact that there is a book about the Bulls written in German and concentrating in that area in the Ardennes sector. I also mentioned to him that I had provided the mayor of the Monschau-Hoffen area in this particular area a book that's called The Butler's Battling Blue Bastards, which is strictly about the 3rd Battalion of the 395th Infantry Regiment of the 99th Division, and of their whole action, including a detail of the night fighting that pursued after I left. I left December the 29th. The rest of my outfit left the area January the 30th, and then from then on they were different outfits would ask for this particular battalion to be assigned to them for the different positions that we and areas that we had become expertise in.
I'd like to ask, you mentioned at night you had the buddy system on guard duty.
Yes.
What is the buddy system?
The buddy system is 2 guys. I think this is to keep each one of us alert and not have the deal like so many times out on an outpost or something in an area. If it's just one fella, he might go sleep, or he's more apt to maybe be captured or be in night being caught unawares by an intruder. So the buddy system is, and they say when one goes, the other goes, to protect one another, to be on the outlook for one another. And not only that, there's a possibility that protection is better in 2s than 1. Now at night, we helped each other, because being out there in that cold, man alive, it was cold. And heavens, we could talk loud voices and all with that wind and storm. Heavens, you couldn't hear anything 5 foot, 2 foot. Dark, pitch black, fog and everything. There's very, very, very few clear nights. And of course, even though the area might have been mined or booby trapped and all, they still were night patrols out, and I'm not saying that every night was that way, but man, the biggest part of the time, you got to remember, this was through winter season. Man, it is cold. I don't even tell you, snow, all that filth and everything.
Have you been back to Belgium?
No, sir.
Would you like to go?
I sure would, but there's always been the convenience of it. There's always been the money end of it, and you get in raising a family and doing the other necessities of life. My wife says, "Why don't you go?" And of course, she doesn't fly. She doesn't want to fly, and she don't like to fly, and she never has tried it. But bless her heart, I respect her wishes, because there's a lot of people that way. I remember the first time I flew, and of course that was back in the 30s. But that time that I flew, boy, going across the channel, man, that was something to behold. Man, I was leaving that area. No, a lot of my cohorts, buddies, have been back, and there's a fella in Germany, I think, I don't have his name, address where he lived, but he conducts a lot of tours for people in the 99th to go back. There's been a number of books written about the 99th. One of them is about the Battle Babies, I believe, which we were called because we were so young. General Lahr was the commander of our division overseas. And incidentally, after the war, hostility was over, the 99th did become an army occupation. But I wasn't there. But incidentally, I was home on furlough, my first furlough when I got back from overseas, latter part of March and the first part of April, someplace in April, I guess. And I was walking down the street, Main Street, between Robson and Broadway, near the Criterion Theater, and I had a lady lieutenant stop me. And of course, PFC, as I was, and with all my ribbons on, you know, and that I had, seeing that she was a female, I come to attention, and of course immediately she said arrest. And she introduced herself. First she said, "Well, soldier, you the 99th, I noticed you have the checkerboard patch." I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she said, "When did you leave them?" And I said, "Well," and I explained. Of course, by that time she had told me that she was Ivy Lahr, the daughter of the general, and she had been his aide down at Camp Maxey. And then when we went overseas, well, then she was transferred to the Borden General Hospital at Chickasha, and she happened to be up here. And during all this Battle of the Bulge, you know how commands shift and so forth, and then they send back for historical deals and meet with the general of the First Army and things of this nature. There was a short period in there where her dad had been relieved of command, and she would, and due to the blackout that they were having, and they kept quiet about us being up there because there were just two divisions on the front line, First Army at that time, as I understood, our division, the 99th, and then the 103rd, the one, and I don't recall which side they were. Well, during the Bulge, for all practical purposes, the division was annihilated there. They destroyed over 2 regiments.
Yeah, the 103rd.
103rd, it was the line division of the
Golden Line.
Golden Line. And so that ended that, and this was in preparation, we understood, because of that offensive that was getting ready to go. It's the same time the Germans launched their offensive. So he,